Good evening. We start tonight with breaking news. Former President Donald Trump says he has been indicted again. And just like the last time he was indicted in New York and then arrested, so much of what we're learning right now is coming from the former president's own posts. In the last hour, he posted on his social media site, Truth Social, saying the Biden administration has told his lawyers that he has been charged, calling the investigation into those classified documents found at his Mar-a-Lago estate a hoax. In another post, he says that he has been instructed to appear in Miami at a federal court on Tuesday. The president then goes on to push ahead to his re-election campaign and says this is a dark day for the country. Now, NBC News has confirmed the indictment, but federal prosecutors are not elaborating. And again, just for the big picture here, if you're tuning in and you're wondering, wait, I thought he was already indicted, all of this gets very confusing very quickly. So to recap, this is the second indictment of former President Donald Trump. The first happened in Manhattan that dealt with the hush money payments, alleged hush money payments made to former porn star Stormy Daniels. This one is in Florida, and it's pertaining to those classified documents found at Mar-a-Lago. Joining us now is NBC News senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett. Laura, we were going to mention tonight that we are in an indictment watch. It now looks like it has happened. What do we know about this particular case?
Gadi, we know that the federal grand jury has returned the indictment. He's been informed. He says that his attorneys have been informed. What we are still working to confirm here is what precise charges he's facing. Why does that matter? Because they range from everything from showing off a classified document potentially to someone else, which is quite serious, obstruction of justice, which carries something like 20 years, or just maintaining a retention of classified documents without any authorization. Still, very serious charges that we're talking about here. We need to see how many counts. We need to see precisely the contours of that in order to evaluate this. But just the fact, of course, that a federal grand jury has indicted the former president for a federal crime would be a first in history. This is not the first time that Trump has been indicted, but is the first time that he is facing federal charges, which obviously are quite serious. He has maintained all along that he has done nothing wrong. His defenses have ranged from I can declassify anything I want to I can declassify things by just thinking about it. That is not a theory that obviously would be endorsed by prosecutors, but in order to really understand what he's facing here, again, we have to see the precise contours of those charges, which I assure you we are working very hard to confirm.
And Laura, the difference between Manhattan and this are many, but one of them is the procedure and the process of a possible arrest or turning himself in or the appearance at a Miami federal courthouse. He's saying that he's supposed to appear in Miami at that courthouse on Tuesday. What do you think that appearance will be about? How different is this process going to look than what we saw there in Manhattan earlier this year?
Right. So the Manhattan case is a state case. This is a federal case. So that's a difference right there. But in terms of the actual logistics, some of it will actually look quite familiar. He says he's received a summons. That happens in a case like this where they know where he is. They're not going to go arrest him. This is not a violent crime, but they're going to tell him you need to show up to understand the charges and to actually have your formal arraignment, which is where he would typically enter a plea. Now, in most cases, people show up in court. They hear the charges. It's sort of a, ministerial, easy thing. It happens within minutes. Obviously, in the former president's case, it will be an enormous spectacle, as it was in all likelihood last time this played out in Manhattan, if he actually does decide to show up there on Tuesday, which you would imagine he would, to turn himself in. The reason all of this is playing out the way it is, and it makes it hard for us, is because it's still under seal. Grand jury processes are secret on purpose for the process to be protected. And so the reason we can't bring you exactly everything as we wish we could right now is because it's still under seal. At that proceeding on Tuesday, if in fact it's the arraignment as we believe it is, that's where we would actually see the first formal unveiling of the charges, unless, of course, the Justice Department decides to go to a judge and get an order to have them unseal it earlier.
And Laura, it's wild to hear you talk about how these things are under seal, and that's normally how it plays out. And yet you're constantly reminded that things are not playing out how they normally do in the court of law or when you have a case like this unraveling, because the the suspect here, the former president, is posting so much information about the case and also arguing in front of the court of public opinion a lot of the facts of the case that are still under seal. So how does that dynamic play into all this? And I got to ask, huge picture here. It feels like some of this is pushing the judicial system that's supposed to be built on trust to the seams. Does it feel like that to you at all?
It's a stress test, Gadi, as it was last time when he was facing state charges in Manhattan. That was its own stress test of the system as he continued to lambast the prosecutors, even the judge in that case. They had to go so far as to get a protective order because they're so worried in that case about him just tweeting out evidence that's part of the grand jury process or going after the prosecutors. And because of his approach to all of this, obviously it makes it extremely complicated for prosecutors to go about this in the normal case.
And a quick question here. When it comes to what we're going to see in Miami, do you think that we will start to see a spectacle forming at the places where he's supposed to be? I keep thinking ahead and just imagining. I mean, this is Florida. This is very different than New York.
Yeah.
I just keep seeing like big campaign rallies in front of a federal courthouse. Do you envision that happening?
No, I imagine that there will be a show of force from law enforcement down there for that very reason. They want to keep it secure. They need to be able to proceed with this in the proper way and be able to protect all the parties, protect the people who are going there to work every day there, the judges, the attorneys, everyone. And they know how to secure a federal courthouse. The authorities are really good at doing this. They do it every day. This is not the first time they've had a high-profile defendant in Florida. It's not some sleepy courthouse. It has hundreds of federal employees. They know how to do this. However, they've never had a former president indicted. They've never had a former president come in for an arraignment. So, of course, it's going to be unusual. But I can assure you that place is going to be locked down. It's going to be very secure. It will not be a campaign-style rally. Now, of course, it's not New York. It's not Manhattan, as you say. He has plenty of supporters in Florida, as he does all over the United States. But I would imagine around that courthouse, it will be fortified, Gadi.
All right, Laura Jarrett, thanks so much. I hope you stick around so we can chat a little bit later. We do have right now NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos, also moderator for Meet the Press, and NBC News political director Chuck Todd. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm not sure if you heard the last part of that conversation, but there's a big difference in the optics, a big difference in the procedure, I think, when it comes to federal versus what we saw in Manhattan. But this is home turf for former President Donald Trump. Danny, Chuck, how do you see this playing out starting next week and then going forward at that federal courthouse?
Yeah, the arraignment's going to be a very uneventful event. I mean, other than the fact it's probably the most significant arraignment in the history of federal criminal law. But procedurally, it's mostly a non-event, at least in terms of substance. It's, you know, you plead not guilty. You get the charges read to you formally. If you want to, you can have that waived. But after that, it's a bit anticlimactic because then the case proceeds into the pretrial discovery phase. So procedurally, not a whole lot happening. It shouldn't be a very long affair. What I will be looking for is whether the court imposes any pretrial conditions of any kind. That's the kind of thing we should be looking for. But much has been made of whether or not the district here there in South Florida is going to be favorable to Trump or not. Look, the bottom line is the jury instructions are essentially going to be the same whether you're in federal court in Florida. They're going to be the same whether you're in federal court in Manhattan. And while it's true Manhattan or D.C. are probably unfavorable juries for the former president, the bottom line is this. Federal criminal court is not a place defendants want to be. Your odds of being convicted are over 90%, well over 90%, and they have been for many years. If you're indicted in criminal court, the odds are you are going to be guilty, and the odds are you are going to prison because there really aren't a lot of federal summary offenses. They exist. I've heard of them. They exist in theory and rumor, but not really. Most criminal defendants in federal court are facing almost outlandish odds. And that's why folks should look at this indictment in federal court much more seriously than Alvin Bragg's indictment in state court in New York.
Now, Gadi, let me pick up on the political side of things. I'll tell you what I'm looking for, which is how is he going to try to turn Tuesday into a political event for himself? Exactly. And let me throw in, look, Miami-Dade County, home of the infamous Brooks Brother riot. Guess who was one of the organizers of the Brooks Brother riot back in the day, which, of course, has to do with the counting of the ballots back during the 2000 election 23 years ago, so it's a generation ago. A guy named Roger Stone. Roger Stone lives about 20 minutes from that courthouse. There are a whole bunch of, so this is where it suddenly is on Trump's home turf. Are these places where that jury pool is going to somehow lean right? The answer is a big no. This is, Miami-Dade is still a light blue county. Broward's a deep blue county. Palm Beach is a deep blue county. But where he does have him home field is there's a lot of operatives. There's a lot of political chicanery, to use a word that I don't think we use enough these days, that I expect to see attempted. Some of them may be blessed by Donald Trump. Some of them may not be. And the circus-like atmosphere, I think, is going to be a feature that the Trump world is going to try to lean into, because the more it looks like people are supporting him, the harder it will be for his political opponents. You know, Trump's entire focus is going to be on how this helps him in his presidential and doesn't hurt him. So that's what I'm trying to, waiting to see is what does he do on Tuesday to try to turn this into a circus?
Chuck, I'm so glad you said that. And Danny, I'm so glad you're here. It's funny because we have three different perspectives, I think, with the three of us here. Danny, you've been through the entire legal process. Chuck, you've seen, every major election of recent history. And yet I've been in the thick of it normally and covered a lot of Trump rallies, covered a lot of the days that you thought that we'd see normal procedure, and yet you would see something that was being orchestrated by the Trump campaign and turning it into very much a spectacle for the spectacle's sake. There's something to be said about the convoy coming through. There's something to be said about the flags flying. And again, I know that this is going to be at a federal courthouse, but in Miami, in Florida, where you have Governor Ron DeSantis, who is now going to be running against the president, it seems like this has all of the makings for a spectacle. So, Danny, I guess the question is, from a prosecutor's perspective, if something like that happens, what are the types of things that prosecutors are going to be asking for from a judge to try to keep the spectacle as controlled as possible?
Well, the Bail Reform Act does put some limits on what a judge can do in terms of restraining a defendant's freedom prior to trial. We don't know what the charges are yet. The kinds of charges dictate under the Bail Reform Act whether or not someone is permitted bail or whether there's a presumption that any set bail will not ensure their attendance at trial. Until we know the actual charges, we don't know for sure. But generally speaking, the kinds of charges that make you ineligible for bail or very difficult to get bail are things that involve guns, drugs. Highly doubtful we're going to see anything like that in this case. But does a judge have a lot of discretion? Yes. I don't see a federal judge especially, getting too creative. I see a judge shying away from anything like a gag order. I think a federal judge is going to recognize that this kind of case involves someone, a defendant, who's going to be engaging in political speech. And the Supreme Court has said that, yes, all speech is protected, but arguably political speech is super protected. And so former President Trump needs to be able to talk about his case because he is in a campaign. Now, if there are some restrictions on the kind of discovery that can be disclosed, much like in the New York case, the judge there restricted the kind of discovery that Trump could post on Truth Social or something like that, you could see something like that. I really don't expect it. I think a federal judge is going to play this much more straight down the middle. They're just going to address bail. I don't even really expect that the federal government is going to ask for President Trump to have even a particularly high bail or even be incarcerated pending trial. I don't even see that being an ask based on just the charges that we've thrown about. But again, since we don't know what they are, it's really hard to predict. But federal judges do have a lot of discretion. I just don't see a federal judge getting too ambitious with restricting Trump especially in terms of his speech.
I mean, his ears must have been ringing. We're talking about political speech, protected political speech. And on Truth Social right now, former President Donald Trump has posted what looks like a 4-minute-long video. It is historic. It is going to be his side of the story, so we're going to play this. I hope you two stick around, because we're going to be analyzing this video right after and kind of discussing what we get into. Again, there are no restrictions right now when it comes to this federal case, and so this is the first time we're going to hear from the former president directly from this video. He is posted on Truth Social, so if we've got that queued up, let's take it away.
Very sadly, we're a nation in decline, and yet they go after a popular president, a president that got more votes than any sitting president in the history of our country, by far, and did much better the second time in the election than the first. And they go after him on a boxer's hoax, just like the Russia hoax and all of the others. It's just been going on for 7 years. They can't stop, because it's election interference at the highest level. There's never been anything like what's happened. I'm an innocent man. I'm an innocent person. They had the Mueller hoax, the Mueller report, and that came out. No collusion after 2.5 years. That was set up by Hillary Clinton and Democrats. But this is what they do. This is what they do so well. If they would devote their energies to honesty and integrity, it would be a lot better for our country. They could do a lot better. They could do a lot of great things. But when you look at what's happened to our country in the last 3 years, we were energy independent. We had a strong military that wasn't woke. We were doing so well. We were respected all over the world. We got the biggest tax cuts in history, biggest regulation cuts in history. And what do? You have a president where an election was taken, got more votes than any sitting president in history by far, never anything even close. And they come after me because now we're leading in the polls again by a lot, against Biden and against the Republicans by a lot. But we're leading against Biden by a lot, a tremendous amount. And we went up to a level that they figured the way they're going to stop us is by using what's called warfare. And that's what it is. This is warfare for the law. And we can't let it happen. We can't let it happen. Our country is going to hell. And they come after Donald Trump, weaponizing the Justice Department, weaponizing the FBI. We can't let this continue to go on, because it's ripping our country to shreds. We have such big problems, and this shouldn't be one of them. It's a hoax. The whole thing is a hoax, just like Russia, just like the fake dossier was a hoax. You saw the Durham report. You saw the Mueller report. It was all a big hoax. You had 2 impeachments, and they lost and we won. And we had tremendous support. But that was a hoax and a scam. And now they're doing it again. It's just a continuation, 7 years, even after I'm out. But it's called election interference. They're trying to destroy a reputation so they can win an election. That's just as bad as doing any of the other things that have been done over the last number of years, and especially during the 2020 election. So I just want to tell you, I'm an innocent man. I did nothing wrong. And we will fight this out just like we've been fighting for 7 years. It would be wonderful if we could devote our full time to making America great again. And that's exactly what we did. But now, again, our country is in decline. We're a failing nation. And this is what they do. I'm an innocent man. We will prove that again. 7 years of proving it. And here we go again. Very unfair. But that's the way it is. I just want to thank everybody. We are doing something very special for our country. We're putting America first. I always put America first. And that's why we were in a position. Unfortunately, that position is no longer valid because they've done such a poor job. But we're in a position where we're going to make America great again. I'm innocent, and we will prove that very, very soundly and hopefully very quickly. Thank you very much.
That is the former president of the United States posting on Truth Social, reacting to news he broke about his federal indictment on Truth Social. Again, we're joined by Danny Savalos and Chuck Todd. Guys, got to get your reaction. Chuck, starting with you. Yeah. You watched that. He was talking warfare. Right. This is, a big fight for the future of America. What stood out to you?
Well, number one, he doesn't address the actual charges, right? He doesn't address why he's been indicted. He doesn't. I think that's very notable. He doesn't talk a lick about what he's accused of doing. He knows what he's been accused of doing. So the fact that he didn't touch that at all, I think is worth noting. Everything else was very familiar rhetoric, Gadi. If you really think about it, we've heard all of that before. He has his repertoire when it comes to defending himself from charges is actually very limited, and you heard every one of them. I mean, he comes across always as repetitive. How often does he say the word hoax? And again, that goes to his ability, I think, sometimes as a messenger, because I'll say this, he has a limited repertoire, but what's amazing when you go to focus groups, his supporters repeat what he says right back at you. So what he is doing here with this video is he's giving his supporters the talking points. And that's what folks need to realize here. And I promise you, talk to any reporter, Gadi, you know this, if you go to the next Trump rally, everything he said, you will hear from his supporters at said rally. So that's what these videos are designed for. And look, he sounds like this is what I have just been curious about this whole time. Even if voters start to impact him, he does not sound like a guy who's ever going to quit this race, and he's ever going to stop running. And I don't know how the Republican Party is going to deal with him or figure out how to get rid of him if he is somehow potentially headed for a guilty verdict.
Chuck Todd, thanks so much. I hope you guys stick with us. We actually have Hallie Jackson as well. She joins us now. Hallie, I'm not sure if you were able to watch that video of the former President Donald Trump reacting to the news that he broke on his social media platform. Right. Did you see that?
Yes. Excuse me, Gadi. Sorry. Yeah. The video that he posted there, it is, I mean, you, Chuck, Danny, have been going through that. Familiar themes. I mean, I think that it is no surprise that I agree with Chuck on a lot of that, right? The idea that this is going to be something that the Donald Trump campaign, because remember, he is the Republican frontrunner now, is going to look to try to turn to its advantage here at this point. They may actually get some help from some of Donald Trump's current political opponents. Now, I realize that Vivek Ramaswamy, who is one of the candidates who is running against Donald Trump, is not among the more high profile of the bunch, right? That title would belong to somebody like Ron DeSantis. However, it is an indication, as he's coming out now saying, is the first reaction, notably getting on the board kind of quickly with this reaction to this indictment now that NBC's confirmed, saying, I never thought we'd see the day when the president deputizes the DOJ to arrest his lead rival in the middle of an election. So echoing Donald Trump's claims of partisanship, claims of a politicization or of a witch hunt on the part of the Justice Department. Gadi, keep in mind that this is an investigation that's been going on for about a year now, right? If not a little bit longer, February of 2022. So just over a year at this point, related to the mishandling now allegedly of Donald Trump and these classified documents, bringing them from the White House down to Mar-a-Lago. And while we can extrapolate from past precedent, right, that the GOP base is likely to rally around Donald Trump this time, just like they did for his last indictment, which happened, of course, in Manhattan in New York City. You also have to remember that we are entering unprecedented territory here, right? We have never seen a president get indicted on federal charges. Like this just hasn't happened before.
It's unprecedented, but and I'm not sure if we still have Chuck and Danny. It's unprecedented, and yet it feels familiar. And the reason why is because we know what some of the playbook is. And I mean, again, when we're hearing a lot of this, the meme that comes to mind is that meme of former president in a wrestling match, right? And so he's at the WWF or the WWE, and he's like body slamming people, and somebody's superimposed his face. And so this very much seems to be another wrestling match when it comes to the political nature of the political nature according to the president's former campaign. And so it's interesting because we have the pillars of the judicial system that requires decorum and requires, tight lips when it comes to federal indictments and these types of things that are supposed to be secretive. And then you have a very a brawler, if you will, of an opponent here that seems to be swinging with both fists. So I want to ask you, how do you think that this is going to play out in Florida next week at the courthouse?
Right, like, and I totally hear your wrestling match analogy, Gadi. The only thing I'm saying on that is that it's like a wrestling match that we've just never seen. So, like, we just have not been here before, right? Like, and I just think that's still important for us to remember, because I do think that given the sort of drip, drip, drip of reporting and information coming out over a series of investigations that Donald Trump faces, this isn't the only one, that can sometimes get lost in the mix. As for how this plays to 2024, Gadi, I think that we are going to see some reaction from his Mike Pence, for example, is going to be on a different network and coming up 30 minutes or so from now, 35 minutes. We'll hear what he has to say, although we already know that Mike Pence has tried to draw contrast with Donald Trump on something else, January 6th. Less so, obviously, this classified documents issue for multiple reasons, Gadi. So I do think, obviously, it's going to be something that the Trump campaign is going to try to use in 24. And I think Chuck's point earlier, this is happening in Miami on Tuesday, South Florida. Donald Trump knows South Florida. Donald Trump is a Florida resident here, Gadi, which is another interesting dynamic.
Do you think that this increases his chances of winning a presidential race, or decreases them? Just on
I will give you the answer that I give, which is I wish I had that crystal ball. I'm a reporter, not a pundit, friend. So I will leave the predictions to those.
I had to do it back to you. You always, you do it. You do it to us too. So we'll just wait and see. Perfect answer. Thanks so much, Hallie. And we've got Vaughn Hilliard, who also joins us tonight. Vaughn, I'm not sure if you were able to see that video, the 4-minute video that the former president posted there, but can you give us a play-by? Actually, let's take a quick step back, because this stuff gets very confusing, especially when you get into the details and then some of the logical fallacies that you hear. So, big picture, small. We've got different cases going on. We've got a case, an investigation in Georgia that we still have not seen come to a head. We have what happened in Manhattan, and we have what happened today. Can you just restart us on what we are seeing here today?
Right. This investigation and now this indictment is about documents that, frankly, Gadi, we still don't know what was in those documents. These are classified materials that the public should expect to get a better understanding of what was in them once this indictment is unsealed. But they're classified documents for a reason. And there's a reason the Department of Justice is choosing to prosecute Donald Trump. It's because there was national defense material involved. There was also the Department of Justice in a court filing last year. They laid out the fact that there was information related to human intelligence sources. There was information as it related to technology spying capabilities of the U.S. And I think that when you're talking about this here, this all goes back to last summer when National Archives went to the Department of Justice and said that Donald Trump had not turned over all the relevant documents from his time in the White House. They then issued a subpoena on June 3rd. The Trump's lawyers said that they had turned over all the relevant documents. Well, 2 months later, the FBI executed a search warrant and found 184 more classified documents with classified markings on them, which would suggest that, in fact, the Trump and his attorneys had suggested that they had turned over documents when they had not.
Yeah, and Vaughn Hilliard, you bring up some incredible points. Obviously, the former president had some things to say about documents and some of his political opponents as well. So we're going to be touching that in just a bit. Don't go anywhere. We do need to take a quick break here. So stay tuned. We're just getting started. More on the Trump indictment when we come back. Hey, welcome back. We are covering breaking news surrounding former President Donald Trump. According to his lawyers, Trump has been indicted on 7 counts, and they are dealing with that classified documents probe for the alleged mishandling of over 100 classified documents. The twice-impeached president is the first one in U.S. history to face federal criminal charges. Joining us now is NBC's Vaughn Hilliard. We were just talking, Vaughn, before the break there about, the historic nature of this, but also the claim that former President Donald Trump has made about current President Joe Biden and the documents that were found in his garage and the documents that have been found in other politicians' houses. Can you paint the differences that we've seen in some of those cases?
Right. Number one, only one individual involved had a subpoena issued to retrieve the documents. That was Donald Trump. There was no subpoena that was issued to Mike Pence. There was no subpoena that was issued to Joe Biden. The Pence investigation, that closed this week, according to our Laura Jarrett. As for the President Biden investigation, the special counsel continues to investigate the documents that he was in possession of. But this is the part where Donald Trump, we're talking about last summer, June 3rd, 2 years, a year and a half after he had left the White House, in which it took FBI search warrant to go in and find those more than 100 classified documents here. And exactly what was in those documents is still not clear. I think it's important to understand the New York Manhattan district attorney's charges that he faced 2 months ago. Those were state charges. These are federal charges, all felonies that he is facing here, 7 counts that we now know. He is the first major presidential candidate to be under criminal investigation in the heart of a presidential election here. And we're looking at more like probably next summer, next fall, into when this trial would actually begin. And if, in fact, he were to be found guilty, you're looking at potential prison terms. Of course, there's a lot that goes into play there. You're talking about if he were to be elected, he could potentially pardon himself. There could be, a situation in which there could be even a legal back and forth over one particular charge that he could be potentially facing, in which it suggests that somebody would have to forfeit their ability to run for federal office in the future. Now, there's some discretion over exactly what the Constitution lays out versus what Congress has written into statute. But these are serious charges that he is going to be facing, Gadi. In this, when you talk to, legal experts, they say if Donald Trump had just complied with the subpoena of the Department of Justice and turned over these relevant documents, that he would not be facing these criminal charges here at this time.
Vaughn Hilliard with some of the most important context of all of this, the possibility of that self-pardon. Vaughn, thanks so very much. We've also got NBC News Chief White House Correspondent Peter Alexander with us tonight. Peter, the White House has declined to comment on this indictment, but President Biden, he hasn't commented very much on the special counsel investigation itself. But you've been in very close contact with them. Can you tell us a little bit more about the strategy to not wade in here?
Well, obviously, this is a historic moment. We've never seen anything like this, as you've heard from so many of my colleagues and your guests already tonight, Gadi. I think it's clear that from this White House, from this president, we should not expect them to engage in this in any way, based on conversations in and outside of this White House. We've heard repeatedly that were there to be an indictment of the former president, of Donald Trump, that they would have no intention to touch this with a 1,000-foot pole, politically recognizing the potential harm that could do to the case, no desire to engage. The Hatch Act prevents them from speaking from effectively the White House podium about a candidate, about political matters like this one. But earlier today, during the news conference that was held at the White House, I was in the East Room when the president was hosting his guest here for the first time at the White House, the United Kingdom's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. And at the end of the news conference, anticipating the potential for an indictment, given all the headlines and all the anticipation that this moment could come, I pressed President Biden about this moment and about what he would say to Americans. Here's part of that exchange. Take a listen. Mr. President, what do you say to Americans to convince them that they should trust the independence and fairness of the Justice Department when your predecessor, Donald Trump, repeatedly attacks it?
Because you notice I have never once, not one single time, suggested to the Justice Department what they should do or not do relative to bringing a charge or not bringing a charge. I'm honest.
In the words of President Biden, saying, I'm honest there in my exchange with him literally a matter of hours ago, and only a matter of hours before the announcement of this indictment. The White House, the president have repeatedly tried to make very clear that the Department of Justice is independent from this White House, have focused repeatedly on the rule of law, and that the rule of law should be what guides this entire process. I think one thing that's going to be striking as we talk about the days ahead, Gadi, and we're going to be in unprecedented again in territory we've never seen before, is when the president, former President Trump, was first indicted in New York. President Biden was in Minneapolis. He was delivering remarks at an event there. So you were left with this split screen where you saw the president delivering his remarks, doing his job as president. Meanwhile, you saw former President Trump on a tarmac arriving in New York City. It was a stunning split screen, and one that I think the White House is plenty satisfied with. And it's very likely, as you will see wall-to-wall coverage of this tomorrow, there will be a not so dissimilar split screen with headlines all about Donald Trump and this indictment. And President Biden is scheduled to travel to North Carolina tomorrow. He's delivering remarks on the economy. He's scheduled to visit with troops at Fort Liberty, what was formerly Fort Bragg in North Carolina. So as it relates to the White House's view, this president's view, I think that's the image of their handling of this situation that they hope guides the day. Gadi?
Fascinating to hear that split screen idea. And we also have, I mean, I don't even know how many boxes, I guess 9 other boxes that'll be in play tomorrow from that large GOP race for the candidacy for president here. How do you see that playing out? I mean, first off, this is happening in Florida. Florida's Ron DeSantis's home turf as well. Do you see his opponents from the GOP possibly taking a step back and letting this become somewhat of a Democrat versus Republican, or Donald Trump versus the Democrat-controlled judicial system as he claims? Or do you see this become a battle royale?
Well, I think what is striking, remember that just this week, former President Trump's vice president, Mike Pence, the North Dakota governor, Doug Burgum, and Chris Christie, one of those who initially endorsed Donald Trump back in 2016 after running against him, and now is one of his chief rivals and antagonists. All 3 of those, Pence, Burgum, and Christie, all announced their candidacies for the Republican nomination this week. But who is going to be the one who is getting all the headlines for not just this week, but for the weekend and for the days, weeks, and months to come? It's going to be Donald Trump. And that has been one of the biggest challenges that so many of those other candidates have faced as they try to sort of get some oxygen in the room as it relates to the Republican field right now. You know, you can divide the Republican field into a bunch of different slots. And I've been speaking to pollsters for some of these Republican campaigns who say there's at least a 35% number of sort of true MAGA supporters, particularly in states like Iowa and New Hampshire, the key first caucus state and first primary state. Then there's like 15 to perhaps 20% of those who are focused on social conservative issues, religious conservative issues. Mike Pence, certainly among those, Tim Scott as well. And then there's the others who are a little bit more open-minded and some who are willing to move on, perhaps, from Donald Trump. But in spite of that, Donald Trump still carries so much sway in this field right now that it doesn't allow for that cacophony, all the other voices to sort of break through. And I think you're going to see a lot of these individuals reluctant to turn off Republican voters, likely Republican voters, by doing anything but criticizing the Department of Justice right now, which at the end of the day only amplifies the situation and amplifies, perhaps helps the standing of Donald Trump in this Republican primary field. Gadi?
Peter Alexander, that's sounding like a battle royale with the former president right in the middle. Thank you so much. Joining us now is NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Michael, I'm not sure if you've seen that video yet, but I just wanted to wind you up and let you go. The first indictment, looks like we might have lost Beschloss there, so we're just going to recap what we know right now. We're being told that there are 7 counts that the former president Donald Trump has been indicted with. We've got Vaughn Hilliard, joining us right now, and we've got the former president very active tonight on his platform, Truth Social. Vaughn, thanks so much for rejoining us here. Just talking with Peter and this idea of this battle royale and with all the different players on the Republican race for the White House. How do you see this playing out? It also seems like there's going to be a race to be the one that is most aggressive in taking on the former president now that we have the news of this indictment.
Right. This is where Republicans over the last years, these elected officials and now candidates, have put themselves into a box because Donald Trump propagated this idea of the deep state, the FBI, Department of Justice, looking to undermine the MAGA movement, the conservative movement that Trump has heralded. And what you have seen are these Republicans that have gone to his defense and suggested that this is an effort to undermine Donald Trump. You saw this as late as last August when the FBI FBI executed the search warrant of Mar-a-Lago. You saw Republicans, including even the likes of Mike Pence, saying this was overreach by the Department of Justice. And so you already have these Republicans on the record. You know, you go back to 2 months ago, Ron DeSantis, when Donald Trump was indicted on those state charges in the Manhattan hush money payment case. Ron DeSantis suggested that he would not extradite Donald Trump if Donald Trump chose to not go to New York on his own volition and turn himself in, that he would essentially protect Donald Trump in Florida so he didn't have to face those charges. And so this is really that catch-22. I was talking with a Trump ally just the other day who said that in the months ahead, these Republicans are going to have to make the decision. Do you stand behind and defend Donald Trump, or do you now try to cast him aside and say, let the court system play out? But then you face the real possibility of being viewed as a hypocrite among the Republican electorate, because frankly, there's 2/3 in an NBC poll here this spring, 2/3 of Republican voters nationally said that they felt like Donald Trump was being unfairly targeted and politically targeted. 2/3 of Republican voters. That's a major share of the electorate. And so this is going to be really tough, reality for these Republicans, Gadi, to play in when they have defended Donald Trump for so long against these very types of charges.
It seems like this is just adding accelerant, adding gasoline to this race, and we could possibly see the front runner decided a lot sooner than I think a lot of us thought before today. I do got to ask, I mean, you were at Mar-a-Lago when the first indictment happened, right? I remember we were talking, and you were right outside of Mar-a-Lago, and I remember vividly there were some people coming by with those Trump flags. How do you think things are going to go next Tuesday and then beyond that? How do you think things are going to look in front of the courthouse as these court dates are set?
It's a good question, Gadi. I don't know. I was at Bedminster, where he's actually spending the summer, his private club in New Jersey, where he is now. I was there earlier today. And I think the question is, what sort of a demonstration or reaction do you see? Because let's be some real talk here, Gadi, is that there's a great part of the American electorate that is getting a different source of news, that believe that Donald Trump is truly being unfairly targeted. Of course, this is ultimately going to come down to a jury to decide one way or the other. But these are serious charges that federal prosecutors have brought forward. And it's unlikely, if you got to go before a jury, that you would be bringing charges that you don't feel good about here. And when we're talking about documents, Donald Trump has not denied the fact that he held on to these documents. But what he has told his supporters is that he had every right to have these documents, saying that he declassified them, even though there's no evidence that he did. And so really he is waging a campaign against the facts of the case as opposed to the facts that it happened. He is not dismissing that, in fact, he had the documents and that he did not turn them over. And that is the difficult part here. And the other hard part for prosecutors, but also Republicans and even Democrats that would like to use this to their political advantage, is that, frankly, among those more than 100 classified documents that the FBI recovered, the American public doesn't know just how dangerous those documents may have been if they had gotten into the wrong hands or the hands of a foreign government or bad actor, because they're classified documents. So this is a really tough case to play out in the court of public opinion. And to a great extent, we have seen his supporters really come to his defense time and again. And there's little reason to believe that they won't this time around.
And yet the 4-minute video that we just saw, it was framed as a rallying cry almost. You heard language like warfare, and that, I believe weaponized the judicial system, weaponizing the Justice Department. Do you think that that's going to resonate with not the MAGA base, but resonate with people that may be on the fence right now, may have voted for the former president in the past, but we're starting to rethink things, and they see this indictment come out of Florida and are trying to decide which way to go? Do you think that this will resonate with them?
It did not in the 2022 midterms. The candidates who were backed and endorsed by Donald Trump lost in a time in which usually, if it's a Democrat in the White House, usually Republicans do well in the midterms. And what you saw was Donald Trump last year go around the country touting election denialism, right? And that which doesn't match with what actual reality is. And you saw voters, those very voters that you're talking about, dismiss it. For Donald Trump, he has one playbook. He always has had one playbook, and that is to fight. There is no apology. There is no take the foot off the pedal, right, and take some ownership of a situation. It is to fight, and that is why you saw him and his campaign just yesterday release a campaign ad showing the face of Jack Smith, the special counsel appointed by the Department of Justice to oversee this investigation and prosecute Donald Trump on this front, call him a wolf and make Donald Trump the martyr and make the Department of Justice special counsel, a career prosecutor, somebody who is a very clear enemy to a political movement. Donald Trump so often, Gadi, in the last couple months has said that I am simply standing in the way for you, that they are coming after you, they're coming after your rights, and that he is the one that is on the front lines. And so we're really dealing with a battle over the way in which folks are viewing our justice system here in this country. And Donald Trump intends to weaponize his political campaign for the purposes and the money behind his political campaign for the purposes of trying to negate and undercut this indictment, the investigations, and ultimately the criminal charges against him.
And talking about those battle lines, I mean, one of the things that seems to be in his advantage at this point is the secrecy that we normally see surrounding cases at the federal level, right? It's so much of this boils down to trust, right. And it's very difficult for people to trust a system that says, trust us, we can't tell you, we won't tell you, we're not going to tell you until this all plays out in a year, when you have somebody else saying this is all a lie, this is a witch hunt, and constantly feeding information or misinformation, depending on how you look at it. But in a lot of ways, what we see is the former president just constantly engaging in logical fallacies, but using them as a shotgun approach. And it really comes down to who do you trust? Do you think that we may see a change in the playbook from federal prosecutors, or is this going to be a straight play from the feds and exactly what we saw during the campaigns from the president?
I think that the Gadi off of that question is how speedy of a trial can take place here. If this is dragged out and the trial doesn't begin until summer or next fall, you're in the heart of a general election. Of course, if he loses the primary, none of this matters. But Donald Trump is already calling this election interference. He's calling this election interference because he is saying the mere indictment puts a stigma over his head and that of his campaign, suggesting that he has done wrongdoing. And that is a difficult reality that ultimately Merrick Garland decided to go forward with the investigation and ultimately go forward with the indictment here, despite knowing the political headwinds and the backlash it may cause. And when you look at the fact that these are 7 counts, we don't know yet exactly what the counts are, but all of the charges that were being considered were from concealment to the retainment of national defense material, but then also obstruction of justice. And the question here is, why was he obstructing the Department of Justice, the FBI, from acquiring these documents? What were in those documents that were so important to him? Was there material that he was looking to do something with? That is what, because of the secrecy of the process, hopefully we can get a better understanding of once that indictment is revealed on Tuesday.
Fingers crossed. Von Hilliard, thanks so much.
Thanks, Gadi.
And turning now to some other guests we have, Cynthia Oxney. She's an MSNBC legal analyst, former federal prosecutor. Also, NBC News legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Carol Lamb also joins us. So I do want to ask, we were just talking about those 7 charges of 7 counts that we know of. And we also know that there are potentially over 100 documents or around 100 documents. What does that tell? Can we read into what those charges may be just based on the fact that there are only 7, when in Manhattan we saw over 30 counts and a lot of them pertain to a very small amount of documents?
I don't think so. I think if there's a document retention, that could include, all of the 100 documents. So no, just the number of documents. We don't just sort of count documents and that gives us the counts. That's not going to be relevant. It will be interesting to see what they pick. They had, there was a lot of options. There's this Espionage Act. There is the document retention, which, depending on which section of document retention, can be a very big deal because it can prohibit Mr. Trump from holding federal office. So that is a big deal. The obstruction is a big deal if it's in there because it's a 20-year felony. False statements comes all the time, but it would be difficult to understand a false statement would have to almost be a conspiracy because Trump didn't really speak to the FBI agents or to the prosecutors. So that means there's somebody else involved in that. If there's a conspiracy, who else is involved? And were any of the lawyers charged? Or there's so many questions out there that we just don't have the answers to.
And Carol and Cynthia, actually, so the Washington Post and the New York Times just crossed this. NBC News has not been able to verify this. Our team is working very hard at that, but this speaks straight to those. They are saying, the Washington Post is reporting right now that the charges include illegal retention of government secrets, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. And again, that is the Washington Post and the New York Times talking about those 7 different charges. So, Carol, what does that tell you? Illegal retention of government secrets, that's something that we expected. Obstruction of justice and conspiracy. What picture are you seeing take place as we look at this federal case?
Yeah, so to Cynthia's point, I mean, there are a lot of ways that indictments can be brought. And what I would expect, especially seeing the conspiracy count in there, what I would expect is that this is going to be what they call a speaking indictment. In other words, Jack Smith is going to use that conspiracy count, which requires that there be a meeting of the minds between the former president and somebody else to commit some crime. And that agreement can be formed at any time, right? So maybe it was formed after he got to Florida. But in any event, what a conspiracy count is often used for is to allow the prosecutor to then describe all the things that happened during the course of that conspiracy. I would expect to see a so-called speaking indictment like that because Jack Smith is going to want to inform the public why these charges were brought and not leave them to speculate that perhaps they're not very serious charges. And so you have that aspect with the conspiracy count. And the conspiracy count also allows Jack Smith to bring a lot of evidence in that he might not otherwise be able to get in because he can get in now any evidence in furtherance of the conspiracy. So I think that's very important. The illegal retention of documents, I think if that is the charge that was brought by Jack Smith, it's very important to note that he perhaps brought charges that are not dependent on those documents being classified, because we've heard numerous times now Donald Trump saying, I could declassify documents just by waving my hand and saying they're declassified, or just removing them declassifies them. And so if he brings charges based on the retention of documents that are secret or closely held, but not necessarily classified, then that gives him more leeway, and it does away with one of the potential defenses.
I wanted to ask you both, the normal way, the way that we're used to seeing a lot of these federal cases play out is with federal prosecutors playing it very close to the book. They're methodical, they take their time, and they're very limited in the information that they release. Do you see that as what we're going to see play out over the next couple of weeks, or based on the subject, based on the former president's use of social media and his constant communicating with a very large portion of the population, do you think that playbook could change on the federal level?
I don't think it will. I think Carol's right. I think there'll be a speaking indictment. And then, yesterday, NBC News caught Jack Smith walking into the courthouse, and he wouldn't even look at the camera or even look at the reporter, much less talk to him. And my guess is that's basically what's going to happen. He'll have a speaking indictment. The Attorney General will have a press release. I mean, we'll have a very quick press conference. Maybe Jack Smith will stand behind him, and he may have 5 words to say, and that'll be the end of it. And his talking will be in the courtroom and not in the media.
Carol, do you agree?
Oh, yeah, I definitely agree with that. And remember, something we haven't really talked about yet is the fact that this indictment means that Merrick Garland approved this indictment. I mean, the special counsel has freedom and some independence to do the investigation, but the ultimate decision still really rests with Merrick Garland. He can overrule the special counsel. He has to then explain that to Congress. But in this case, unlike the Mueller case, the Mueller investigation, there was agreement, apparently, between Jack Smith and Merrick Garland that this case should be brought. And let's bear in mind also, although this was a grand jury located in Florida, this indictment was brought by a federal grand jury in Florida. So at least half of that 23-member grand jury, decided that these are appropriate charges to be brought.
Right.
Carol, Cynthia,
Gadi,
thank you so very much. Oh, yeah.
One more comment. We've had a lot of discussion the last couple of days on venue. And, there obviously was a way that it could have been brought in D.C. But one thing that I think we haven't highlighted enough is that the Justice Department here, my guess is, has also taken into the legitimacy issue. I mean, there are a lot of people in this country who think, Trump can't get a fair deal and he can't get a fair deal in Washington and blah, blah, blah. And so why not bring it exactly where he claims is his backyard? And so that if there is a conviction, that it will be a legitimate conviction and that they can have some belief that it's righteous and just. And I think that plays into it, not just the legal aspect about, exactly where did the conspiracy touch and at which point did he claim he declassified it? When did he steal the documents? Did he steal them when he was getting off the plane, or did he steal them when he was still at the White House? All those discussions go into a venue discussion, but also there's a legitimacy discussion, which I think was really smart here by the Department of Justice, and it does show a great confidence in their case.
Cynthia, such a fascinating point. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Actually, speaking of Miami, we've got NBC's Ken Delanian down in Miami right now. I think we have him. If we can go to Ken Delanian, yep, there he is. Ken, we were just talking about Miami. Can you hear me okay? All right, we're going to try to get him mic'd up here. Okay, so it looks like we have Ken in Miami. We just don't have audio with Ken there. Carol, actually, I do think we have Ken. Sorry about that. So, Ken, we were just talking about venue, and we were just talking about why possibly Miami as opposed to Washington. Your thoughts?
I lost it again. Gadi, I'm sorry, I lost part of your question, but I think you asked why Miami. Why did they bring this case here in South Florida after months of investigating with a grand jury in Washington, D.C.? And I think the very simple answer is this is where most of the alleged crimes occurred. Now, federal prosecutors usually have a lot of leeway about where they can bring a particular case. If one small bit of conduct in a case happened in that district, they can usually bring it there. And so that's why it appeared they were intending to bring this case in Washington, D.C., where they would have had a very favorable jury pool from their perspective. A lot of Democrats, a lot of Trump opponents in Washington, D.C. But somewhere along the way, it's pretty clear the Justice Department started to become concerned that they were going to have a problem on this issue of venue, that Donald Trump was going to be able to challenge it if they brought the case in Washington and not in Florida. And so about a month ago, they essentially started transferring everything down here and began presenting witnesses before a grand jury down here. Now, the news media was not aware of that until very recently, until a few days ago when we started learning about this grand jury in Florida, and we all sort of mobilized and came down here, and this is ultimately where they decided to bring the case. And what legal experts tell me is that it's less likely to be challenged on the grounds of improper venue now that it's here in Florida. On the flip side, though, it's going to be a much more politically diverse jury pool. There are a lot more Trump supporters in this general area, the Miami area, than there are in the District of Columbia, Gadi.
Quite the calculus there, Ken Delanian. I'm so glad you're down in Miami for us. Thanks so much for joining us. And that does it for us tonight. I'm Gadi Schwartz. Stay right here for continuing coverage of the second indictment of former President Donald Trump.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.